Welcome, everyone. Simon Rosenberg from Hopium Chronicles. We're here for a live event with my dear friend Rob Shapiro. We had a major set of economic event or potential economic events happen this weekend with the president threatened to put 25 and 50% tariffs on our good ally and our friend Colombia for not accepting two flights of migrants that were being brought back to Colombia. We almost had a really extreme trade war with one of our closest geopolitical allies. And it was a reminder that this Saturday, the president has promised to put on 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico, 10% tariffs on China. And so all of a sudden, the reality of these tariffs are with us now. And I asked Rob to come on as one of our leading economists in the Democratic Party over the last 30 plus years, over the last generation, former Clinton administration official, former chief academic advisor to Bill Clinton, to just talk to us about tariffs, inflation, around the impact of what is potentially going to happen if Trump starts really implementing all these things that he's talking about. What do we believe is sort of conventional wisdom economic thinking about is likely to happen over the next few months, as opposed to the magical thinking, right, that is often being displayed by our president and his allies. And so, Rob, welcome. Thanks for being here today.
My pleasure.
And and let me just get to the first question, Rob. Just
Okay.
talk a little bit about tariffs. Talk about how they work. Give everyone sort of this baseline understanding, because the president seems confused himself about what they are. So it might be helpful if you could just make sure that everyone here has a baseline understanding of what tariffs are and how they work.
Certainly. And let me just start by noting that, economists argue about everything. There are one or two things on which there has been a consensus from Adam Smith to today that covers every notable economic thinker. And that is that tariffs are destructive, are economically destructive. The way they work is that one country says, all right, anything that we import from you, we are going to put a tax on so that it costs more. And in order to discourage people from buying your things. Now, the tax, however, does not fall on the foreign producer. The tax, when things from China come in and they're on their way to Costco, Costco picks them up at the port or airport where they arrive, and Costco pays the tariff. So Costco has every incentive to pass on that additional cost that Costco has paid to as much as they can to their customers. And the theory behind them is that it encourages domestic production. That is, when a foreign pair of shoes costs more, and demand for that particular shoe goes down, American producers can step in and increase their production. And that is supposed to create jobs. Well, the problem with that is twofold. One is that the American producers will tend to try to match the price of the tariffed foreign good or come right under it. It's what economists call shadow pricing. And that just means that consumers have less money to buy things because they're spending more on the kind of good that is subject to the tariff. That means they have less money to spend on other things. And that means it depresses demand for everything else. So the economy slows. So that's one effect. The other is that we don't live in a world in which there are two countries producing and consuming. We live in a global economy. And if that means that half the goods that we import from China, we import as because they're inputs for things American manufacturers are making. So we're directly raising the price on goods produced by American manufacturers. The other catch for trying to put tariffs on today is that, and we saw this with the last tariffs, with the first Trump tariffs on China, and that is what China does is it uses a third country. It ships to the United States via Vietnam, via Malaysia, via a country which is not subject to the tariffs. And consequently, the good comes in to a US port from Malaysia. So in a global economy, tariffs are very kind of leaky, as they say. And that means they're not much of a threat to other countries. However, the United States is in a different position. The United States is such a big economy. And because we are imposing tariffs on our two neighbors, that means we don't have many opportunities to use a third country when China or other countries we impose tariffs on retaliate with their own tariffs, which is something which always happens. It's not something that might happen. It always happens. It happens politically because the people in the other country are mad and they want their government to take steps. Um, and it happens because that reduces the leverage that the United States would have by imposing tariffs on Europe, for example, or Canada or Mexico. We can say you've got to make these concessions. Though it's not really clear what concessions Trump wants from Mexico or Canada. It's not even clear what concessions he wants from China. We're in negotiations with all these countries all the time. But if he thinks it's leverage, then the other countries, and these are all substantial economies, the three of them are our three biggest trading partners, both ways. And that means they've got as much leverage over us as we do over them. And in fact, they may have more leverage because China in particular can use these third countries to get around the tariffs.
Rob, can you talk a little bit about, there's these sort of, as you pointed out, there are these foundational understandings in the work that you do. And one of them, and sort of one of the greatest animating principles of the post-World War II order, was that trade wars in the 1930s led to shooting wars. And that they trade, the way I like to describe it is that in this kind of theory of the post-World War II order, the tariffs were almost like the equivalent of chemical weapons, right? That they were dangerous and they could escalate and cause lots of damage, and that's part of our own experience. Can you talk a little bit about what happened in the 1930s and why we have this understanding that escalating tariffs, when starting to be used in the way that Donald Trump is clearly describing, it's the reason why today in my post today and in the post on Saturday, I showed the clip of the head of the WTO, the World Trade Association, saying that if these tariffs start leading to cascading tariffs where countries are putting countervailing tariffs on one another, that would be catastrophic for the economic well-being of the world, right? And for the head of the WTO to use a term like catastrophic, right, at Davos when she spoke last week, should have been a little bit alarming to the American business community about what Trump is really contemplating here. So, can you give us a little bit of a history lesson about what happened in the
Sure.
1930s and what that and how we should be thinking about that at the current moment?
Right. Well, it was 1931, and the United States was in a recession, an extended recession, and gone on for a little over 2 years. A lot of people were out of work, and revenues were down. And somebody believed, Smoot and Hawley, who sponsored this, and Herbert Hoover, who also sponsored it and supported it, believed that by imposing tariffs, we would stimulate production at home, because the prices of foreign imports would go up, and so U.S. producers would say, "Great, let's produce more so we can compete with them." Well, there were lots of problems why it didn't work. The main thing was, um, we were imposing universal tariffs, or nearly universal tariffs, and everybody else retaliated. This was a world with a lot of hostility going on, a lot of issues in foreign affairs, the rise of fascism, instability because of um, the deep recession. Didn't really turn into a depression till after, Smoot Hawley really turned it into a depression, because trade collapsed all over the world. And all the people employed in industries that exported, they lost their jobs because there were these high tariffs wherever they used to export. And the tariffs raised the prices at a time when people's incomes were falling. And a terrible combination. It causes what economists sometimes call a death spiral, where the original cost cascades and so increases. And the world went into a deep depression. Now, Roosevelt did reduce the tariffs in 34 and again in 37. But the world was already in a depression. Reducing the tariffs was not enough to stimulate the economy. And incidentally, there was a study just done at Yale, and if Trump were to impose what he pledged in his campaign, which was a universal 10% tariff on everyone, and a 60% tariff on goods from China, our tariff rates would be comparable to those at the start of World War II. Before the entire process that began after World War II of setting up the General Agreement on Trade, which negotiated reducing tariffs, and created a lot of the prosperity the world saw in the 1950s and 1960s.
Yeah, I mean, I think as somebody who's not an economist, but who's been operating in this arena for all my adult life, I think it's hard to overstate how much so much of the general theory of global economics has been to reduce tariffs and not increase them. I mean, it's been this sort of 80-year long effort to, reduce these barriers to trade because of the experience of the 1930s and 1940s, where the whole world went to hell over stuff like this. So Trump is bringing back a
Right,
theory of economics and geopolitics that has been that is seen in the profession as deeply dangerous and
right.
unbelievably risky and could unravel the entire global trading system that has made us the most prosperous nation in the history of the world in a time when we are in a time when you also have, I mean, part of Rob, what I think is so interesting about what's happening now with Trump's tariffs is that part of what's driving it is this need for income, right? He's looking for sources of income
Yes.
because they've made very large commitments for reducing corporate tax rates and individual tax rates or maintaining the tax cuts that are already in place. And they can't get the cuts on the other side, right? They don't have the ability. And so, among the things that are being discussed, not only would tariffs increase prices on everything for everybody, right, which was a fundamental betrayal of his core commitment to the campaign in the campaign to lower prices, not only would his immigration strategy, which, as I went over with David Leopold, is not targeting criminals, it's actually trying to dramatically reduce the number of immigrants living in the United States by millions and millions and millions of people, including legal immigrants, by the way, who are here legally and have jobs, right? These are all working people to create a massive labor shortage in a time of full employment,
That will
which
also drive up
right,
prices.
right. I'm going to tee this up for you to explain what happens now when you create this toxic stew, right? And then you have, and the Fed, has already slowed down interest. Trump is now in his magical thinking thinks that the downward pressure on prices is going to come from the Fed cutting interest rates rather than raising them. And also he claims that somehow energy costs are going to go down when there's a lot of evidence they're actually going to go up, right, in the coming months. And so talk a little bit about how, and then finally, the thing that's been most stunning to me, to be honest, is in terms of where they're going for more revenue to cut
Mhm.
in their initial tax plans. They are looking at raising middle class taxes, just overt middle class tax increases while cutting taxes on wealthy people, which will raise costs, and then cutting subsidies of things like the ACA and other things, Medicaid,
Mhm.
that keeps healthcare costs low, which would also be raised costs. So we have costs being raised through tariffs, costs being raised through the immigration strategy, costs being potentially raised through middle class tax cuts, costs being raised through cutting of benefit programs that directly lower costs, improve health outcomes and other things for everyday people. It seems like this is just an unbelievable betrayal of this core narrative and story that he told us throughout the election, that he was obsessed with lowering costs for everyday people, right? And it turns out that it looks like he's picked the interests of the oligarchs, where he's maintaining the need to cut taxes on corporations and wealthy people. And part of the way he's going to do that is by increasing costs in everyday people. And as Jamie Dimon said over a couple days ago, well, people are just going to have to eat it and recognize that with the tariffs, things are going to cost more, which if you're wealthy, right, daycare costing a little bit more and healthcare costing a little bit more and food costing a little bit more, no biggie, right? If you're an average everyday worker, right, this is potentially going to be really, not so good. So what do you think about all that?
Well, I mean, look, um, he betrays every promise he's ever made. From the promises he's made to his wives, to the promises he makes to the American people, to the promises he made to all the people who worked for him and didn't get paid. This is someone who says whatever he believes will give him an advantage at that moment. When the moment passes, he looks for the next thing that will give him an advantage. But beyond the psychology, um, tariffs are a sales tax. That's what they are. They're a tax you pay when you buy a good that has been subject to the tariff. And remember that most goods are subject to these tariffs because most goods include inputs that come from abroad. It's not just buying a shirt that was made, a t-shirt that was made in China. It's buying your smartphone. It's buying your computer. It's buying your car. It's
It's buying the wood that goes into your house,
right,
your building or your
right.
addition you're putting. There's huge potential increases in construction costs, right?
And buying the gasoline for your car.
Right.
And so if you think of it simply as a tax, then you see exactly what he's doing. He's paying for tax cuts for profitable companies and high income people by increasing the taxes on everybody else. It is a direct um, redistribution of income from very direct from from working class and middle class Americans to rich Americans and corporations which are owned by rich Americans. And so it's kind of shameless because it's so, but this is one of his qualities too. He does everything in full sight, which for many people kind of takes the sting out of it because they say, at least initially, they say, well, if it were really bad, he wouldn't admit it, right? So this must be good in the way he says. I think the public reaction is going to be very strong. And one of the reasons is that the pandemic inflation has made American consumers much more sensitive to price increases. That's why everyone became so concerned about egg prices, which came from avian flu. It was a shortage, just like most of the inflation during the pandemic came from shortages caused by disruptions in supply chains and companies shutting down factories when the economy collapsed. He's going to get a very strong public response to this. And, you know, he can say that immigrants are rapists and murderers. And most people don't know any unauthorized immigrants, or they see them all the time. They provide services for them all the time, but they don't know them. And so the claim is, you know, can pass muster with a lot of people. But that's not true with prices. That's something everybody experiences themselves every day. I actually think the larger effect, if this goes out, if this cascades and we get very broad tariffs, is going to be on growth. I think we're going to see, you know, by one estimate, just the original policy that he announced on 10% tariffs and 60 on China. By one study from Yale, will reduce GDP by 1.5 points. Well, if your GDP is rising at about 2%, that means you're very close to a recession. So, and of course, the downturn or the slowdown magnifies all the effects because you've got higher prices and less income. And that means that Americans are squeezed even more. Um, and so it's and the other thing to keep in mind is that um, much of our economy, mo probably half the industries in the American economy um, are dominated by a small number of corporations. There are three companies that provide 80% of the country's cell phones. Three, four companies that provide 80% of or 70% of streaming service and internet access. But that's also true in food in pork processing and beef processing. It's true in chicken processing. It is true in a majority of the things people buy. And that means that um, they can raise prices even more easily because there's less competition to force them down. I mean, it's not an accident that cell phone rates are essentially the same no matter who your provider is. They're pricing in concert with each other, whether though they don't talk about it, because that would be a legal problem. And that what we're saying is that the disruptions in the economy that he's proposing, in the context of where the economy already is, and the disruptions in the tax burden, the disruptions in prices, the disruptions in the labor force, um, uh, these these are making the economy very fragile, and very vulnerable to a shock.
Right.
Every
Well,
economy gets shocks.
well, and let me build on that for a second, Rob, which is that um, what I wrote about today and what I've been writing about a lot for years now is that um, the central foreign policy goal of China and Russia is to, or one of the central policy goals of China and Russia and many of our adversaries, is to weaken the American-led global order that was built after World War II. That when communism ended, China and Russia both, in their own ways, came into that global system. The entire world that was part of the big Clinton project, which was to extend the American system to the unaligned and former communist world. We were both part of that during the Clinton era. It was the right thing to do, by the way, and I'll go to my grave believing that. And I think it was an enormous foreign policy accomplishment. Um,
The data show it was right.
yeah, the data shows it was right. But it seems what is so extraordinary to me at this moment is that Donald Trump seems to have as a goal, a strategy of his presidency to secede, for the United States to essentially secede from that order. And where it's manifesting in its early stages is in the tariffs, right, which are a sort of secession from the global economic system that America imagined and built after World War II and all the things we discussed earlier. It's more recently manifested in his territorial ambitions, which would violate really the core founding principle of the post-World War II order, which is national sovereignty, right? This was sort of the absolute bedrock principle of the United Nations and the entire global. And in fact, the rationale for why Europe and the United States are fighting so hard in Ukraine was that Russia was really trying to weaken and attenuate that global system that was based on national sovereignty. And it is, I think that this is a hard thing to talk about, but it's also something that we must talk about because the president seems to have as his goal, like Russia and China do, the weakening or the ending of the American-led global system. Because if you don't believe any longer in national sovereignty, where we can just go take the Panama Canal and take Greenland away from Denmark, which, by the way, the President of the United States told the Danish Prime Minister on the phone last week that he was going to take it. He was going to take Greenland. This was communicated on a phone call, right? That if we now no longer believe in national sovereignty, which is one of the founding principles of the post-World War II order, and if we believe that we can willy-nilly put 25 and 50% tariffs on Colombia or other countries because they pissed off Donald Trump about whatever, right? Where are we?
Well, tariffs really play a very large historic role in the rules-based world because in the 1950s and into the 1960s, tariff cuts were a principal instrument of US foreign policy. That is, we said to every country, if you will align with us against the Soviet Union, we will unilaterally cut our tariffs on your goods. You don't have to do anything in return on your tariffs because everybody else was kind of, on their backs in the 1950s. And we built the alliance through tariff cuts. And through tariff cuts, stimulated those economies. So they became stronger allies. And this was always understood. Tariffs were always understood as destructive to both countries, the country that imposes it and the country that is subject to it. And tariff cuts have always been positive for both countries. But in this case, it was also a very important instrument of US national security. Trump is unraveling our national security, and the tariffs are part of that. It's not just his belligerence against Denmark and Panama and Canada. It's his belligerent attitude towards every other country in the world.
Yeah.
Um,
And Rob, just to put an exclamation point on that, I mean, I hope people understand that the tariffs on Canada and Mexico at 25% is the equivalent of Brexit, right? I mean, it's the beginning of us unraveling the North American economic arrangement that has been central to our prosperity. It is, folks in the chat have mentioned Trump is also now trying to remove us from, the World Health Organization, from the Geneva Convention. It was clear that our new defense secretary does not believe in the Geneva Convention. I mean, he's made it clear that we will be unbound, America will be unbound by international rules of war that exist. He also said he's going to pull out of the Paris Climate Accords. And the thing is, what folks should realize is that it's not like they're proposing some alternative, way that this is all going to work, right? In the way that they're sort of taking a blowtorch to the federal government right now and just doing, and attempting to sort of dismantle the federal government. This is all about a wrecking ball or tearing things down without there being an alternative proposal for how all of this is going to work. And what's so terrifying, I was at a dinner once with an incoming ambassador to Mexico, a small dinner of smart people in Washington, and I've done a lot of work around US-Mexico trade and border issues. And I was definitely the least expert of anybody in the room. And one of the first things that was said is that, our NAFTA has been one of the most successful foreign policy initiatives in American history because we have this neighbor that historically had not been friendly to the United States, that, two longest land border, in the entire world, that is now, and the busiest border crossings in the entire world, right? Is, our close friend and ally. And that, so the tariffs, we've seen much more in American media, the reaction from the Canadians, because it's happening in English, right? But
right.
the new president of Mexico has been very unbelievably critical of Trump. The Colombian president was unbelievably critical of Trump. The Brazilians are flipping out about the treatment of the migrants that are coming back into, and so all of a sudden you have this America appears rather than the nation that keeps things stable and is sort of the anchor of this global system, this rules-based global system. It looks like that we're intentionally trying to blow it up and act like a rogue power and a rogue nation without there being any kind of understanding of what happens on the other end. And it's why, I will be honest, right, for all of you, is that even though we all knew this was all going to potentially happen, right? And that he had said these things during the campaign, that we knew that he had, became president in 2016 to a great degree because of Russians' extraordinary intervention in the election in 2016 and owed Putin. And he's had this incredible relationship with Putin. Here we are, right? Trump unbound, Trump, you know, perhaps in his very first few days, the most significant thing that he has made clear that he's going to follow through on is essentially rapidly unraveling this global system that has kept us prosperous, free, and safe for 80 years. And it is something that's hard to talk about, right? Because it's so kind of unimaginable. But here we are, and at this moment. And I just wondered, Rob, if you could reflect a little bit on that.
Well, you know, when you are the most powerful and nation in the world, and you have the greatest economy in the world, um, it means that the powers of the presidency become enormously meaningful for everyone in the world and have greater direct effects on every American's life than in most other places, and certainly in most other democratic countries. Um, and there was, the framers and the founders said, the big danger is that you get somebody who wants to be a dictator, or you get someone who is what they would call evil and what we would call mentally unbalanced. And he is mentally unbalanced. And I think the most encouraging is that because he is driven by these internal demons, and will not listen to anyone who understands a particular issue that he's fixated on. It means he makes big mistakes. And the tariffs are going to be one. And the deportation policy is going to be. And when you make big mistakes, it has consequences for everyone in his party. If his economic mismanagement slows the economy and raises prices, it will weaken his hold on congressional Republicans. And that, frankly, is half of the basis for his political power, is his hold on the Republican Party through threats to mobilize his followers to challenge the member in a primary, something he started from the beginning of his first term. He always understood this. But it will weaken it. And given that he's operating with razor thin majorities in both houses, if in 6 to 8 months we're seeing inflation moving up to 4%, for example, and unemployment moving up to 4.5% to 5%. His hold on Republicans in Congress will weaken. He will try to assert, you know, his definition of presidential power is whatever he deems necessary to do what he wants. And the courts, that will be up to the courts as well. But a weakened president has less leverage even with the Supreme Court. He didn't win the cases when he had lost an election. I think I have been thinking for some time that the project for Democrats is to focus on a couple issues with the goal of weakening his support. Do not just talk to Democrats. You have to appeal to independents and some Republicans who in the end said, well, all right, even if I don't like him. The way to tame him is to weaken his support.
Well, and Rob, let me jump in and say that, what I have argued here about how we go forward is that we're going to have to pick two or three things. There's so many things happening every day, right? But
Yeah.
that there are going to be two or three things that are where we have to be on offense, where there's a strategy, where we're prosecuting an argument over time. Part of the reason I asked you to come on today is that I really do believe this toxic economic stew that he's cooking up in going on offense and really talking to the American people, particularly because independents, when you look back at polling over the last couple of years, independent voters were often aligned with us on things like healthcare and reproductive freedom and democracy, but they weren't on the economy. I mean, they were
Right.
very much sensitive to inflation and the perception of rising prices. And we know that, and it was often, very significant differences. It was fascinating. I wrote about this a lot over the last couple of years. But the thing that I just want to say to the Hopium community and those watching is that we have to go on offense about all this stuff. I mean, we have to understand these issues because what Trump's doing, what still continually just sort of is baffling to me, is that, we operate in likely scenarios and unlikely scenarios, right? When you try to sort of think about things and how they're going to go forward. I mean, the likely scenario here for all to see, the Fed slowed down the interest rates, right? The market had been nervous about Trump, a few weeks ago. The likely scenario is that things are going to play out the way that we're describing, right? I mean, it doesn't mean it will, but it's the likely scenario. And given the risks involved in this, to have people like Jamie Dimon saying, "Oh, we can handle a little bit of inflation because of the tariffs, no biggie," right? And sort of the beginning of the creep of magical thinking, Trumpian thinking into, sort of sophisticated economic arenas where they're like, well, maybe it won't be so bad. And maybe all these things we believed about tariffs are wrong. And maybe, worker shortages and paying more for, getting rid of three-quarters of ag workers, won't really drive up prices, right? You're starting to see this kind of wishful
Mhm.
thinking, right? Even into sort of like more sophisticated economic arenas, right? This is the thing that I've been, and the Fed meeting is coming up this week. It's going to be fascinating to see how they deal with this. The president has already demanded the Fed cut interest rates when, even though the economic rationale underneath it is doesn't lean that way. And so the point I want to make to everyone here is the reason I'm hosting this and the reason I've been writing about this so much is this is an area where we just have to go on offense. right? We have to be
Yeah.
unbelievably aggressive. We've got to stay with it. We've got to explain what is a tariff? Trump keeps claiming that foreign governments pay the tariffs and when we're not. I mean, it's an unbelievable lie and delusion and craziness. And we have to engage in the information warfare part of this far more aggressively. But you have to start from a place of greater understanding in order to do that, right? And so part of what I have been learning at Hopium over the last few weeks, I used to run a think tank. Rob and I did a lot of work together at a think tank, not at a political organization or a Substack. And I'm really realizing now that one of our roles at Hopium in the coming months is going to be to create greater understanding of the big things that really matter, right? That we're engaging in, and this whole basket of issues and these issues of, because I will tell you, as somebody's operated in this space, my jaw is on the floor about how much we all, those of us who are conventional thinkers and have old think instead of new orange Trump think, right? Is that, this imaginary world that he lives in, we're looking at, icebergs here, right? Like hitting icebergs, economic icebergs. And we should not allow them to define that as being old think as opposed to reality think, right? Like the real world. Because part of the battle here is going to be over the interpretation of how this all goes, right?
Yeah.
And the information aspect of it. Because, Paul Krugman of all people has written that he thinks that Trump's going to start cooking the books, and to start actually publishing false economic data in order to cover up, what his economic policies are actually doing. So I feel like at Hopium, sort of getting into this place and just staying here for months and months and months and months, given out, Rob, my work, I've written about economic issues, the sort of intersection between politics and economics for decades. You're one of the leading thinkers. I think we as a community have an important role to play here. I think as being, being educating ourselves and bringing that knowledge and understanding into all of our communities across the country. And frankly, encouraging Democrats to be of the areas where we engage and go on offense. In my view, this is central because the stakes are so high, and for our security, for our economy, for our future, and all the things that we all care about. And for us, I have kids who are 24, 22, and 19, and I'm now aware that there's a very high likelihood that the world that they go out into in their lives, America will be seen as a rogue and pariah nation and not the nation that existed when we were young, Rob, which was admired and revered by the people of the world. And that, the stakes on this are really high. I mean, Donald Trump may have had a modest political victory in his own mind over what happened with Colombia in the last 24 hours, but at enormous cost to our standing in the region. Because what Donald Trump was standing for, let's just be clear about what happened in that negotiation with the Colombian government. Donald Trump wanted to be able to treat Colombian citizens like shit. And that was important to him, that he humiliated them and put them in handcuffs, and that he then had the additional humiliation of transporting them by the American military, which is complicated stuff in sovereign nations, that we're just announcing that we're coming in to your country with military planes as opposed to civilian planes. And this is why the Mexicans have not allowed some of these flights to land either, by the way. It hasn't gotten as much attention. But what he's doing is that he's telling these countries, fuck you, right? Like, fuck you, fuck all of you. You guys are pieces of shit. He actually literally said on Friday, I don't care about Latin America, right? And, what a message for the American president to be sending to
Well,
tens,
what he's saying
hundreds. Yeah,
is that only the United States has the right to protect its border. Nobody else does.
right.
He's saying that to Colombia. He's saying that to Mexico. He's saying that to Denmark and Panama. And why? Because we've got the biggest military.
Right.
So it's
And now we've got
uh,
a drunken lunatic running it every day in the Pentagon. But Rob, we've hit time. I want to just say that, this discussion was probably a little bit less full of hopium than many of my talks. But it's also, we have to get smarter and stronger, everybody. And that's part of what I realized that, is going to be a part of what we do here is to bring in experts like Rob. We had David Leopold here I shared that video on Saturday of David, one of the leading immigration experts. It was a tremendous interview. I learned so much from that. And to really try to be vigilant about helping make sure that our communities, that, we teach the teachers in essence, right? That the smarter we get, the more we can help bring that understanding into all of our communities, right, around the country. Because hopium is, many of you are leaders of other communities in your own communities, right? And so it's important in that regard. And I also think that for Democrats, given that our own understanding of how we lost the election was that we mismanaged or couldn't get over the inflation issue, we have to go on offense here and really look like we're the protectors or the people fighting for everyday people, fighting for our security, fighting for opportunity for the people of the United States. And the battle lines in this are very clear already, in my view. And so, for example, Rob, I mean, one of the things that could be happening today is that every Democratic elected official could be joining together and asking the president not to raise tariffs on Mexico and Canada and China this weekend, that we don't believe this is good economic policy. We need to be laying down markers ahead of time and helping educate voters ahead of time, not responding, right? Just responding, but getting
Right.
ahead, dictating the terms of the debate, getting ahead of things. We have to learn how to be a successful opposition. And I think that our work here can help with that. So thank you
Yeah,
for your time today.
I
Yeah.
do think we need to get past feeling afraid of it. And because that paralyzes people. And I think we need to recognize that a lot of his followers sincerely believe that they're doing the right thing. And we have to respect that sincerity as we oppose them and try to convince them. There's nothing that Trump wants more than for everyone in America to accept the frame that you're either my friend or my enemy. And you cannot have democracy in that frame. There is no democracy. And so we can disagree on everything with his followers. He's a total lost cause himself. But we need to respect them as well. And that's how you get dialogue that can really move the country. I know that's not kind of the way a lot of people approach it because he makes everyone so angry. But Bill Clinton was the most successful politician of his generation, and I never saw him approach anyone, any opponent. It's not how he did it.
Now, Bill Clinton's line was when talked about people who opposed him, he referred to them as people who are not yet supporters. Was his line. And I heard him actually say it once myself in close proximity, and it was one of the funniest things I'd ever. Very Clintonian, right? Somebody
Oh,
not my opponent, just somebody who's not yet a supporter. Okay, Rob, let me go. Thanks everybody. Keep the faith. Let's keep fighting, and let us know. Sorry we didn't get to more questions. I was reading them, so I was trying to incorporate them into the discussion. And this will be out on YouTube later today and on Hopium tomorrow morning. Thanks, everybody.
great. My pleasure.
Thanks, Rob.